75 years old, I sat in silence at a table with a cake I baked myself, candles flickering down to nothing, while across the world my own blood raised glasses to each other on a beach vacation, smiling wide in photos I later saw online. And all of it was paid for with my own money. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I wouldn't care. But I saw every picture, every laugh, and in that moment I made a promise to myself that they would never see what was coming. Thank you for watching, and for giving your time to listen to an old man's truth. It means more than you know. And before I go any further, I would like to ask you to drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Because even though I sat alone that day, I know I am not alone now as I speak to you. I want you to imagine what it feels like to look at a cake with 75 candles ready to be lit, the smell of sugar and flour filling the kitchen, and the silence pressing in on every wall around you. I waited all morning for a knock on the door, for the phone to ring, for someone to walk in and say, "Happy birthday, Dad." But it never came. Not one voice, not one hug, only the sound of my own breathing and the tick of the clock. And then, just when I thought maybe something had gone wrong, maybe there was a surprise being planned, I saw the pictures on my phone. Bright smiles, sandy beaches, my family lined up in the sun with drinks in their hands, laughing as if the world belonged to them, and all of it was bought with my money. I looked at those pictures again and again, each one cutting a little deeper, because those were the very faces I had worked for my entire life, the faces I had sacrificed for, the ones I believed would stand by me as I grew old. Yet there they were, living the kind of luxury I never allowed myself to taste, and they were living it without me. I remembered the nights I came home from long shifts, tired to the bone, but still carrying groceries or small gifts just to see their smiles. I remembered skipping new clothes for myself so they could have new shoes for school. I remembered paying for lessons they wanted, the cars they drove, the houses they now lived in. And it was always my wallet that opened and my back that bent. All of those memories poured into me at once as I sat there with that cake on the table. And I thought about how many times I told myself that one day they would look back and realize what I had done for them. One day they would treat me with the same respect I gave to my own parents. But instead, at the moment I reached 75, when I should have been surrounded with love, I was left in silence. I thought about my son, the way he once held my hand when he was little, how he used to run to me when I came home from work, and now he could not even spare a moment to sit with me on the day I marked 3/4 of a century. I thought about my daughter, who once cried on my shoulder when she was scared of storms, who I promised I would always protect, and now she laughed in the sun while I sat in an empty house. And then I thought about the grandchildren, the ones who would not even know their vacation was paid with the money of the grandfather they left behind. They would only see palm trees and hear the sound of the ocean, never knowing it came at the cost of a man sitting in silence with a lonely cake. Every memory stung like salt in an open wound, and yet underneath the pain there was something else rising, something quiet but steady. I realized in that moment that if they could treat me this way after all I had given, then they did not see me as a man anymore. They saw me as a wallet, as a bank, as someone whose worth ended the moment the money ran out. And that, more than the silence, more than the pictures, more than the empty house, hurt the most. I sat there, not moving, not crying, not breaking, only thinking, because sometimes silence is sharper than any words. And they had no idea that while they toasted their glasses in the sun, I was already planning the day they would see just how much that silence could cost them. As I sat there with my thoughts circling like a storm, I found myself drifting back through the years, to the days when life was hard but simple, when every dollar I earned was stretched to cover not just food and rent, but dreams and promises too. I remembered standing in the cold, waiting for the early bus to work while the world was still dark. And I remembered the weight of lunch pails in my hands, the smell of metal and oil clinging to my clothes when I came home late, and how even when my body ached, I would smile because I knew every hour I gave was for them. I worked when I was sick. I worked when others rested, and I worked when my hands were cracked and bleeding, because I told myself that my children would never have to know the kind of hunger or struggle I had known. There were times I sold things that mattered to me so they could have more. The old watch my father gave me, the set of tools I loved, even my small savings that I once planned to use for a trip I never took. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in their future, and I never thought of it as a loss, because seeing them happy was the only return I wanted. I can still picture the nights when bills piled up, when I sat at the kitchen table with my wife, running numbers on scraps of paper, deciding what we could cut so the children wouldn't feel the weight of it. It was always me who said, "Let them have what they need. I'll go without." And I meant it. I remember the pride in buying this house, the first place that was truly ours, the walls I painted, the floor I polished with my own hands, and how I carried each child over the threshold when we first moved in. I wanted them to feel rooted, to have a place they could always call home no matter where life took them. This house was more than wood and bricks. It was a promise, a shelter that would stand long after I was gone, and in my mind, I thought they would always respect it. Respect me, respect the work that built it. But as I sat there on my 75th birthday, staring at that cake, I realized that promise I carried all those years did not live in their hearts the way it lived in mine. To them, the house was a place to take for granted. The money was a stream that never dried, and my love was something they assumed would always be waiting without ever being returned. The truth struck me with such force that it almost took my breath away. Everything I had built for them had turned into chains for me. Chains of expectation. Chains of obligation, chains that kept me giving while they only took. And yet, beneath that sharp truth, a fire began to stir. I was not a man to shout or rage. I was not a man to beg or plead. But I was a man who had spent a lifetime enduring storms and carrying burdens heavier than this. I thought back to those early days when every step forward felt like climbing a mountain. And I reminded myself that it was not weakness that got me here. It was resilience. They might have forgotten the man behind the sacrifices, but I had not forgotten myself. That thought settled deep inside me, and I knew then that I would not let their betrayal pass unanswered. They may have toasted each other on that beach with my money, but one day soon, they would learn that the man they abandoned still had strength they could not imagine, and they would finally see the cost of taking a good man for granted. I sat in that quiet house, letting the fire inside me grow stronger, and as I thought more about the years behind me, the memories that once brought me joy now carried a sting I could not ignore. I remembered a dinner not too long ago, when I had offered to pay for the meal as I always did, and my son laughed in front of everyone and said, "Dad, you don't need money anymore. What could you even spend it on?" The words stung like a slap, but I forced a smile and stayed quiet, because that is what I had done my whole life, swallow the pain so they would not feel it. I told myself it was just a careless joke, but deep down I knew it was more than that. It was a glimpse of how they truly saw me. Not as a man who still had worth, but as someone they could take from without a second thought. I thought about another moment, when my daughter borrowed money for a bill she claimed she could not pay, and when I gently reminded her weeks later, she waved her hand and said, "Dad, it's just money, you'll be fine." Just money, as if it had not taken me decades of sweat and sacrifice to save what little I had. I let it slide because I loved her, but I never forgot that moment, and I never forgot how quickly she dismissed what cost me so much. Each of these moments piled together, small cuts that I told myself to ignore, but on my 75th birthday they returned to me all at once like a flood, and the weight of them nearly crushed me. It was then I realized that the greatest insult was not the vacation itself, but the belief behind it. The belief that I was too old to notice, too weak to care, too tired to act. They assumed the years had dulled me, that I was nothing more than a forgotten figure sitting in the corner of my own life, waiting quietly for the end. But they were wrong. Every insult, every slight, every moment of disrespect that I had buried deep inside had turned into strength. And as I sat there in that empty house, I promised myself I would never let them think of me as powerless again. I did not shout, I did not curse, I did not throw anything in anger, because anger passes and is soon forgotten. No. I let my silence speak. I let my thoughts sharpen, and I knew that the day would come when they would face the truth they tried so hard to ignore. They may have toasted their glasses on a sunny beach while I sat in silence. But the storm they left behind was only just beginning to take shape inside me. And when it arrived, they would never forget it. The more I thought about everything, the more the pieces of their behavior started falling into place, and it became clear that this betrayal had not begun on my 75th birthday. It had been building for years in ways I chose not to see. I remembered gatherings where they whispered to each other, pausing when I entered the room, their eyes shifting quickly as if I would not notice. I remembered the times they asked me to sign papers without explaining much, calling them simple forms, things to help them out, and though I questioned it, I trusted them, because trust was all I had ever given. I thought back to how often my wallet seemed lighter than it should have been, how charges appeared on my statements that I did not make, and when I asked, they would laugh it off, saying, "Oh, Dad, it's nothing. We'll sort it out." Each time I let it go, because I wanted peace more than conflict, and I convinced myself that love was worth more than answers. But that night, as the clock ticked and the shadows stretched across the floor, I realized the truth staring me in the face. They had been testing how far they could go, how much they could take, and how little I would resist. Every quiet dismissal, every missing dollar, every whisper I pretended not to hear, it was all leading to this moment, when they believed they could strip me of dignity and leave me behind without consequence. They thought old age meant blindness, that I could not see what was happening around me. But they were wrong. I had seen it all. I had simply chosen silence, and now that silence was about to become my greatest weapon. I remember gripping the edge of the table that night, staring at the untouched cake with the candles burned down to stubs, and for the first time in years, I felt no desire to weep, no urge to beg for their attention, only a cold clarity filling my chest. If they saw me as nothing more than a man to use, then it was time I reminded them who I truly was. The man who built their foundation. The man who carried every burden so they could walk freely. The man whose silence had been mistaken for weakness, but would now be the voice of justice. And as I sat there, I could almost hear their laughter echoing from that faraway beach. But I also heard something else inside me, a steady promise that when they returned, the life they thought was theirs would never be the same again. That night, as I sat alone in that quiet house, I began to notice how the little things I had ignored now painted the whole picture. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that their betrayal had not been a sudden choice. It had been creeping in slowly, like a shadow I refused to acknowledge. I remembered walking into a room once and hearing their voices lower, my son whispering something about accounts and access, my daughter replying quickly, "Don't worry, he won't even notice." At the time, I brushed it aside, convincing myself they were talking about something harmless, but deep down a part of me knew those words were meant for me. They were counting on my trust, on my silence, on the fact that I would never question them. I recalled how often they asked for my card, just for small things they said, groceries or bills, and yet the numbers never seemed to add up when I looked at the statements. Vacations, electronics, fine dinners, all tucked away under vague charges, and whenever I asked, they gave me smiles and light answers, saying, "It's all covered, Dad. Don't worry yourself." I wanted to believe them. I wanted to hold on to the idea that the family I had sacrificed everything for would never use me in such a way. But sitting in that lonely silence on my birthday, I finally admitted the truth that I had been avoiding. They had been draining me little by little, long before they abandoned me that day. The thought stung, but with it came something else, a strength that I had not felt in years. Age may have slowed my body, but it had sharpened my mind, and in that silence, I realized I held more power than they ever imagined. They thought they were clever, moving pieces behind my back, but I was the one who signed the papers. I was the one who held the accounts. I was the one whose name was written on every deed. They had mistaken kindness for weakness and trust for ignorance. And in doing so, they had forgotten that everything they enjoyed was built on my shoulders. That night I promised myself I would not raise my voice. I would not beg them to love me. I would not even tell them I knew the truth. I would simply wait, and when the time came, they would see just how much strength still lived inside the man they thought was too old to notice. The days that followed only made the truth heavier on my chest, and though I carried it quietly, every detail sharpened my resolve. I went into my study one evening and pulled out a small box where I kept old receipts and records, and as I sorted through them, I began to see the trail of their greed laid out clear as day. Plane tickets I never booked, hotel reservations in cities I had never visited, expenses that lined up with stories they told me about being too busy to come by. All of it written in black and white, paid for with my name, my card, my life's work. I held those papers in my hands and I did not feel the sting of tears. Instead, I felt a deep calm, the kind of calm that comes when a man finally accepts that love has been twisted into selfishness and that silence must now become action. I thought about the phone calls I overheard, my son saying once, "As long as Dad keeps signing, we're fine," and my daughter replying, "He's old, he won't ask questions." Those words replayed in my head like an echo, and they burned hotter than fire because they revealed the truth I had been avoiding for years. I was no longer seen as a father. I was seen as a door they could walk through whenever they wanted something. I sat in that chair with those papers scattered across the table, and for the first time in a long while, I let a small smile form on my face, not from joy, but from the knowledge that they had underestimated me. They believed I was blind, but I was watching. They believed I was weak, but I was steady, and they believed I was done, but I was just beginning. I gathered every paper, every receipt, and I placed them neatly back in the box, not as a burden to carry, but as proof, a reminder that I no longer needed to question or doubt. The betrayal was real, and the evidence was mine. I whispered to myself that night, "Do not fight them with anger. Fight them with silence, with patience, with the same strength that carried you through every hardship." They were toasting their drinks under the sun, celebrating on a vacation funded by my years of sweat, but what they could not see was that with every laugh they shared, the ground beneath their comfort was already shifting. And when they returned, they would walk into a home that no longer belonged to their greed, but to a man who had finally decided enough was enough. As I sat there with that box of proof resting by my side, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Not because the betrayal hurt any less, but because I finally had clarity. There was no more room for excuses, no more pretending that their actions were careless mistakes. I now knew without a doubt that it was planned, it was intentional, and it had been building for years. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence of the house settle over me, and in that silence I asked myself a question, one I had never dared to think before. What would I do with this truth? Would I confront them the moment they walked through the door? Would I shout and demand answers? Or would I do what I had always done, stay quiet and let it pass? The more I thought about it, the more I realized anger would only give them more power. It would show them that they had gotten under my skin, and what they truly feared was not my shouting, but my silence, because silence carries a weight that words cannot. I looked at the walls around me, walls I had painted with my own hands, walls that had heard laughter and arguments, walls that had stood for decades as my family grew under this roof. And I knew that this house, this place, was mine, not theirs. It carried my blood, my sweat, my years of sacrifice. If they could sit on a beach, drinking from glasses I paid for, while leaving me here alone on the day that marked 75 years of my life, then they needed to learn a lesson they would never forget. I thought about every time they dismissed me, every careless joke, every time they spoke about me as if I was already gone, and I promised myself that this time I would not let it pass. This time, my silence would not protect them, it would reveal them. That night, before I went to bed, I placed the box of papers in a drawer and closed it firmly. And as I did, I felt something I had not felt in years: control. The kind of control that comes when a man stops denying the truth and decides to face it head on. They might believe they had left me powerless, but what they did not realize was that while they toasted in the sun, I was already writing the end of their comfort. And soon enough, When they returned with smiles and tanned skin, they would discover that the man they thought they could leave behind had been waiting with a silence far louder than any words they had ever spoken. The morning of my 75th birthday stretched into evening, and as the light faded through the windows, I realized that this day, the day that should have been filled with voices, laughter, and love, had turned into the clearest lesson of my life. I was alone, not because of fate, but because of choice. Their choice, to put themselves above me, to take from me, and to forget me. I sat at the table staring at that cake, the candles now melted into small pools of wax, and I felt a calmness settle over me, not the calm of acceptance, but the calm that comes when a man knows what must be done. I thought about how many times they had gathered around this table, eating food I paid for, resting in comfort I provided, smiling at holidays and birthdays that I funded. And yet on this milestone, when I should have been surrounded, they were far away on a beach, using my name, my money, my sacrifices to toast each other while leaving me behind. As I sat in that silence, I felt no urge to call, no urge to beg, not even the urge to remind them what day it was. Because the truth was, they already knew, they just did not care. And that realization was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. They had expected me to sit quietly and accept it, to wait patiently until they returned and pretend nothing had happened. But what they did not know was that this silence of mine was no longer the silence of weakness. It was the silence of a man preparing his move. I thought about every account with my name on it, every card tied to my hand, every trust and paper they believed they would one day control. And I knew that all of it still belonged to me, not them. They had mistaken my age for blindness, my patience for weakness, and my kindness for ignorance. But as I sat there in that quiet house, I promised myself they would discover how wrong they had been. That night, as the clock struck midnight, I looked at the cake one last time before placing it away, and I whispered to myself, "This was the last birthday you will ever forget." It was not a threat, spoken in anger. It was a vow born from years of sacrifice turned into disregard, a vow that their greed would soon turn into their downfall. They would return home laughing, thinking life was as they left it, but I would be waiting, not with tears or questions, but with silence so sharp it would cut through the very comfort they had built on my back. And in that silence, they would finally learn who I truly was. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest, but it was not the kind of heaviness that drags a man down. It was the weight of decision, the kind that steadies your hands and clears your mind. I moved slowly through the house, every step reminding me of the years I had poured into keeping this roof over our heads. And with each room I passed through, I thought of the memories it held, birthdays, holidays, even the ordinary days that had been filled with small joys. And I told myself that none of it would be disrespected again. I sat down at the table where the melted cake still rested, and instead of feeling sorrow, I felt clarity. It was time to act. I picked up the phone, my fingers steady, and I began with the first call, the bank. And with a few words, I froze every card, locked every account, and secured every dollar they thought was theirs to spend. Then I called my lawyer, a man who had known me for years, and I told him to close the trust, to rewrite the papers, to make sure that every part of my estate would no longer fall into the hands of those who had abandoned me. Each call felt like another candle lit in my heart, each step a reminder that I was not powerless. I was not forgotten. I was not the weak old man they assumed I was. I was the one who still held the pen, and I was writing the ending of this story. As I placed the phone down, I felt a calm unlike any I had ever known. A calm born from action, a calm born from finally standing in the strength I had always carried but never used for myself. They were still on that beach, still smiling and laughing, believing the world belonged to them, not knowing that the ground beneath them was already gone, that the comfort they had taken for granted was already slipping away. I whispered to myself as I leaned back in my chair, "Celebrate while you can. Because when you come back, you will find out that the man you thought was too weak to notice has already taken everything back." Days passed, and while they were away basking in the sun, I moved through my house with a sense of peace I had not felt in years. because for the first time I was not carrying their weight on my shoulders. I was carrying my own strength. I checked every account, made sure each one was locked, confirmed with my lawyer that the trust was no longer theirs to touch, and I even changed the locks on the doors they had walked through so carelessly. With every step, I felt a part of myself returning, the part they thought had disappeared with age, the part they believed no longer existed. I was not just an old man waiting quietly. I was the same man who once worked 3 jobs to keep this family fed, the same man who built this house with bare hands and tired muscles, the same man who refused to bend even when life pressed me down. I imagined the moment they would come home. Suitcases rolling, voices loud, ready to fall back into the comfort they thought was permanent, and I could see it as clear as if it had already happened. The way they would fumble with their wallets and find their cards useless. The way they would push against the door and realize the key no longer turned. The way their laughter would fall silent when they understood that everything they had taken for granted was gone. I did not picture it with anger or cruelty. I pictured it with calm, because I did not need to raise my voice or demand respect. I had already claimed it without a word. I spent those days preparing not just the house, but my heart, making sure that when the moment came, I would meet them not with rage, but with truth, not with bitterness, but with the weight of every sacrifice I had made. I wanted them to see that this was not revenge born of hate. It was justice born of love betrayed, a lesson they had forced me to teach, one they would carry with them long after the tan on their skin faded and the memory of their vacation turned sour. They would walk through that door expecting the man they left behind, but instead they would find the man they had forgotten. The man who reminded them that respect cannot be bought, love cannot be faked, and silence, when held long enough, can be louder than any shout. The day they finally returned was just as I imagined, their laughter spilling out before they even reached the door, their bags dragging behind them, their voices full of stories about beaches and sun. And yet, the moment their keys failed to turn, the silence that followed was heavier than any words I could have spoken. I watched them from inside, calm and steady, and when they finally saw me sitting at the table, their smiles faded into confusion, then into fear as I explained with a voice quiet but firm that every account was closed, every trust was gone, every card they thought was theirs no longer worked, and the locks they had walked through so freely were now mine alone. I did not shout. I did not curse. I simply reminded them that this house, this life, this foundation had been built by me. And on my 75th birthday, they chose to abandon me, but I had chosen to remind them who I truly was. Their silence was my answer, their faces pale and their laughter gone, and in that silence I finally felt free, not because I had taken anything from them, but because I had taken myself back. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. Your time and your company mean more than you know, and before you go, I kindly ask you to subscribe so you never miss the next truth I share.